There are dozens of telling and retelling of the story of the Pound Gap or the Killing Rock Massacre. In the beginning, before, during, and after the trial, very little official information was given to the local population. In addition, the people of the mountains knew about some rather odd events surrounding the crime. This was thanks to the newspaper articles that started appearing shortly after the massacre. They knew that the Letcher Pike County Circuit Judge had issued a statement declaring that if Dr. Taylor or the Fleming brothers returned to Kentucky, he would have them hanged without trial or jury. They also knew that after the indictment naming Taylor, Adams, and the Fleming brothers was issued on June the 3rd, several odd events happened before Taylor was captured in July. Henry Adams had turned himself in and was released on bail. On June the 9th, Sheriff Holbrook would receive the first of 3 letters from Dr. Taylor and the Fleming brothers telling him that they were innocent and that they were being framed. They also claimed to be fearful for their lives and offered to turn over state's evidence claiming that some prominent individuals were involved in the crime. What's more is the fact that they told the sheriff in the letters where they were and offered to turn themselves in, if the sheriff would provide an escort to the county seat. To the people of the area, these are not actions of guilty men would take. And why would a sitting Kentucky judge threaten these men with death if they returned to Kentucky? In every story we could find about the actions of Taylor, Adams, and Flemings prior to the gunfight which occurred on July 17th, they are never described as behaving in a manner one would expect of men on the run. This is also attested to in the transcript of the trial, a transcript that would be celebrated by Charles A. Johnson in his 1938 book, quote, An Illustrated History of Wise County, Virginia, unquote. Mr. Johnson is ecstatic that he was able to temporarily get his hands on the transcript. The question becomes, why was Mr. Johnson so happy to have, quote, the only existing copy of the transcript, unquote? We believe that Mr. Johnson may have answered this question on page 495 of his book, when he asked some questions of his own. Mr. Johnson asked, quote, was the Red Fox proven guilty beyond all reasonable doubt for the crime for which he was charged? Was the verdict of the jury rendered against him a just verdict? Was the action of the Supreme Court of Appeals in refusing the prisoner a new trial and affirming the judgment of the lower court sound and beyond criticism? There has been much conflict and diversity of opinion among the older class that has been handed down to the young generation as to just what the evidence really was on which the jury passed the verdict of guilt, unquote. From these questions, we think that in 1938, Charles Johnson was just as frustrated with the conflicting stories and the inaccurate information in them as we were when we first started researching the Killing Rock Massacre in 2012. However, even with the transcript of the trial, Mr. Johnson himself falls victim to false information in the telling of the massacre. The easiest example of this occurs on page 378 of the book. Near the bottom of the page, Mr. Johnson repeats the story of Doc Taylor guarding Todd Hall. In the many retelling of the story, it is claimed that Doc Taylor abandoned his guard duty during the night, slipping off in the early Saturday darkness to prepare and commit the massacre later that day. This story is one of the easiest to debunk. Todd Hall was tried in the later part of January 1892 and sent to Lynchburg, Virginia to await his appeal in early February. He was returned to the Wise County Jail in September 1892, even though he had access to certain individuals involved in the trial of Dr. Taylor and the transcript from the trial. He did not have easy access to the type of information we have today. To be critical of Mr. Johnson, his book is hard to follow, especially in his telling of the events which happened around the Pound Gap Massacre. Instead of following a linear timeline, Mr. Johnson jumps around topic to topic and subject to subject. This is a very odd way in which to write a history book. Although we have long had access to his book, Some of it has never been clear. It is only recently that we have gained access to more information. This has helped us to clarify some of the information given to us by Charles Johnson. This raises some questions about the information that Mr. Johnson gives us, or more to the point, the information given to him in his research for his book. He informs us that a couple of judges and other court officials involved in the case were still alive and interviewed. He laments that none of the lawyers for the defense or other individuals involved in the case were alive and available for interviews as well. Again, this is highlighted in his own words when he said, quote, "There have been much conflict and diversity of opinion among the older class that has been handed down to the younger generation as to just what the evidence really was on which the jury passed the verdict of guilt." Unquote. To present the trial of Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor and the evidence that was presented both for and against him will necessitate the need for multiple videos. We intend to present these videos in trial fashion, first giving the evidence for the state, then presenting the evidence for the defendant. However, we must inform you that part of the telling will indeed be fiction. This is because, as Mr. Johnson informs us, at the time of the trial the court reporter recorded everything using shorthand. The custom was to only record the answers given by the witness. This poses a problem not only for us, but for anyone reading the transcript. Each answer ends and is separated from the next with a semicolon. The reader is left with the task of imagining what the question was that caused the answer. Without knowing or understanding this simple fact, some statements from the witnesses seem to combine with the next or previous statement. This can lead to confusion on the part of the reader. To elevate some confusion, we will try to fill in the questions. This transcript covers 23 pages in Charles Johnson's book. For time, some of the witness testimony we will present will be abbreviated. This includes topics such as establishing the identity of the witness, where they lived, and other information. However, with some witnesses such as J. Mullins and Matt and Sarah Blevins, we will present the entire testimony. These videos will probably have the testimony of a single witness. On a final note, we think it is important to inform you that this transcript was later typewritten by a court clerk before being sent to the Court of Appeals. We have discovered that it contains some inaccurate information that we will discuss when we encounter them. We have also discovered in this book that a writ of 12 exceptions were supposed to be compiled by the clerk's office and sent to the appellate court. We know from other sources that this writ was never received by the appeals court, and that at that time of his book, Mr. Johnson informs us that what those exceptions were has been lost to time, and as of this video have never been found. Dr. Taylor would eventually make his way to Bluefield, West Virginia, and be apprehended by Deputy Sheriff Mouchon. He would then be turned over to the Baldwin Detective Agency near Pearisburg, Virginia, after an arrest warrant was finally issued by the judge in Giles County. The capture would take place on a southbound train in Pearisburg, Virginia on or about the 20th of July. Dr. Taylor would then be returned to Wise County to stand trial on the 26th of July. But when he appeared in court on August the 2nd, the indictment against him was quickly quashed and thrown out of court. The first witness on the stand would be Robert Mullins, one of the first men on the scene. Commonwealth attorney Robert Bruce acted quickly, handwriting a new indictment and presented it to the July 26th grand jury. Taylor was then brought back to court to answer this new indictment. The defense objected because they were given no time to prepare for the new indictment. The objection was overruled. Dr. Taylor's defense then moved that the trial be moved to the circuit court, and the trial date was set for September 5th. It is our belief that Taylor's defense made a grave error in doing this, which we will explore in a later video. Gate City native Judge H. S. K. Morrison was presiding circuit judge at the time, but for some reason Judge Morrison declined to hear the case. Charles Johnson speculates in his book that Judge Morrison recused himself because Dr. Taylor had treated him or a family member in recent past. But if this is true, why did Judge Morrison hear the later resentencing trial? On September the 5th, Judge Samuel W. Williams impaneled a jury, although there was some difficulty in doing so. We may go into this jury selection in another video as there is some importance in its selection. Namely, that several potential jurors were accused of having questionable conscientious scruples and was dismissed from the jury for this case. Those scruples were that they were opposed to the death penalty. Now let's begin by once again turning to the words of Charles A. Johnson from his 1938 book, The Narrative History of Wise Virginia. Was the Red Fox proven guilty beyond all reasonable doubt of the crime for which he was charged? Was the verdict of the jury rendered against him a just verdict? Was the action of the Supreme Court of Appeals in refusing the prisoner a new trial and affirming the judgment of the lower court sound and beyond criticism? There has been much conflict and diversity of opinion among the older class that has been handed down to the young generation as to what the evidence really was on which the jury passed their verdict of guilt. Please note, in part of this story the questions asked of the witnesses are fictional. Because of the time of Taylor's trial, shorthand reporting had not come into popularity, nor was court reporting efficiently done. In making a transcript of evidence to be used in an appeal to the State Court of Appeals, the lawyers would write out the evidence of each witness in narrative style. These transcripts were not done in the present-day question and answer style. If the lawyers could not agree on a testimony, the judge would write the transcript of the disputed evidence recording the question. This was done only once in this transcript. Please also note, Robert Mullins and Magistrate John Vint Bentley conducted the official crime scene investigation. The witness testified that he lived in Kentucky about 3 miles from Pound Gap, and that he had seen the place where Ira Mullins and the others were killed. When did you arrive? The witness replied, quote, that he had went to the said point about 1½ hours after the killing, unquote. What did you see or discover? The witness said, quote, that he had found there the bodies of Ira Mullins and his wife, John Chappell, Wilson Mullins, and Greenberry Harris. All were dead, unquote. Robert Mullins was then asked, what did you do then? The transcript states, quote, witness examined the body of Ira Mullins. He had been shot 8 times. There were 2 wounds in the chin, 1 in the head, 1 in the shoulder, 1 in the wrist, 1 in the side, which passed through his body, 1 in his bowels, 1 in his thighs and legs, unquote. The witness is then asked where the bodies were found. The transcript states, quote, at the time the witness got there, the bodies of Ira Mullins, John Chappell, and Greenberry Harris were in the wagon. Mrs. Ira Mullins was about 5 feet away from the wagon, and Wilson Mullins was found 15 steps from the wagon, unquote. Mr. Mullins was then asked about the wagon or the horses. In the transcript it states, quote, the 2 horses hitched to the wagon were shot and killed, unquote. The witness is then asked if he had examined the place from which the shooting had occurred. The transcript says, quote, the witness examined the place from where the shooting was done and found 2 large rocks on each side, and in front, next to the road, a wall had been built up between the 2 large rocks about the height of a man's waist, unquote. The witness was then asked how far the wagon and the bodies were from the point at which the shooting had occurred, and what did it look like. He replied, Quote, "This point was from 15 to 25 steps from the road. Some bush had been cut and stuck up by the rocks, leaves of which had wilted and looked like it might have been cut for a week. There was a little path leading off from there toward the road. Saw no tracks." Unquote. The witness was then asked if he had noticed anything else or found anything there. He replied, quote, "A small heap of pine knots." Unquote. The witness was asked if there was anything special about the pine knots or if he found anything under them. Robert Mullins then replied, quote, "Found 6 cartridge holes, 2 of which witnesses exhibited to the jury, which were .45 to .75 caliber. The whole 6 were of the same size. The cartridge holes looked like that they had been laid down and covered over with a few leaves." Unquote. Narrative sidebar. When the trial began, Dr. Taylor's rifle had not been entered into evidence. Indeed, the July 26th indictment states that Taylor had killed Ira Mullins with his pistol. But by the time of the September 5th trial, it was discovered that the ammunition casings found at the crime scene did not match Doc's 2 Colt .45 pistols, as they were center fire. Recently, we have been questioned about our claim that the shell casings found at the crime scene were rimfire ammunition. To prove our claim, we turned to some valuable information from the various gun collector websites and to 2 of the 4 affidavits attached to this court transcript. We know from various websites that Dr. Taylor's rifle is finally entered into evidence. It is examined by the deputy John Miller, who was a local gunsmith. The rifle was then dry test fired using a shell casing found at the crime scene. The firing pin stuck the shell casing just off center. According to various gun enthusiast websites, this would occur if the shell casing was too small for the rifle. The oft-told tale says that the shell casings were .45 government, which makes sense, as these websites tell us that this type of ammunition was in reality a rimfire .44 that came out about due to a hoax played on the government. For more about this, look for our video and webpage titled Doc's Gun. 3 jurors, W.M. Wolfe, P. DeBusk, and E. Tate, asked for and was granted permission to examine Dr. Taylor's rifle. The only reason why that we know this is that they dismantled the gun and either could not or would not use a part when reassembling the rifle. These men were forced to sign an affidavit on this issue. They omitted the missing part from the affidavit. We only know this because of the affidavits from Sheriff Holbrook and Deputy Miller. However, the final proof of the ammunition was rimfire is found in the affidavit from the 4th juror named I.N. Mills. He states that he and another juror named F.P. Graham examined the gun after it was disassembled and saw that the gun had been recently tampered with, as to make it strike center instead of on the side. He also states that he and Graham only voted guilty because of this examination. After all that we have found while researching the Killing Rock, we believe that the testimony of Robert Mullins and others were changed to match the rifle. We also believe that this is reflected in further testimony given about gun ownership. However, a mistake was made in one testimony. Henry Adams is said to own a .44 by .75 a rifle that did not exist. At least 2 times later, Henry is said to own a .45 by .75. Here is the problem. At the time of the trial, the only rifle capable of shooting a .45 by .75 ammunition was the 1876 Centennial Winchester rifle. These rifles were extremely rare. Yet testimony is given in this transcript that states that hundreds of these rifles were owned in Kentucky. Court is now back in session. We will now resume the testimony of Robert Mullins. The witness was asked, "Do you know the caliber of Dr. Taylor's gun?" The transcript says, quote, "Witness does not know the size of Dr. Taylor's gun," unquote. Mr. Mullins is then asked, "Do you know anyone who owns a gun of that size?" The transcript says he, quote, "knows of two guns in Kentucky of 45 by 75 caliber, one of which belongs to James Potter and the other to Henry Adams," unquote. The witness is then asked about the location of the shooting and how far away were the nearest houses. He replied, quote, "The point of where the parties were killed is in Wise County, about 1/4 to 1/2 mile from Pound Gap, in the woods, and the nearest house to that point about 1 mile from the foot of the mountain," unquote. He was then asked about Louisa Mullins and how she was found, to which Mr. Mullins replied, quote, "Miss Mullins was lying with her apron thrown up over her head," unquote. Robert Mullins was then asked if he or someone else had arrived first. The transcript says, quote, "Witness understands that Jemima Harris and Elizabeth Branham had been to the bodies before he got there," unquote. Mr. Mullins was then asked if he knew why Ira had been found in the wagon. The transcripts tell us that he replied, quote, "Ira Mullins was paralyzed, could not feed himself, and had to be hauled from place to place in a wagon," unquote. He was then asked where and when he had last saw Ira Mullins. The transcript tells us, quote, "Witness saw Ira Mullins on Wednesday or Thursday before he was killed. He was then in Kentucky," unquote. Robert Mullins is then asked where James Potter and Henry Adams lives. The transcript says, quote, "James Potter lives about 10 to 12 miles from the place of the killing. Henry Adams is about 4 miles from said place," unquote. Finally, Mr. Mullins is asked about the whereabouts of Henry Adams. The transcript tells us, quote, "Do not know where Henry Adams now lives. He is said to be dodging," unquote. The witness is excused, and this concludes the first testimony of the case. In his 1938 book, A Narrative History of Wise County, Virginia, by Charles A. Johnson, he asks these questions. Was the Red Fox proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt of the crime of which he was charged? Was the verdict of the jury rendered against him a just verdict? Was the action of the Supreme Court of Appeals in refusing the prisoner a new trial and affirming the judgment of the lower court sound and beyond criticism? Mr. Johnson's book was published 45 years after both the massacre and the trial. The book contains over 400 pages and covers a wide variety of topics. Chapter 32 is the last chapter of the book. The chapter is dedicated to the Pound Gap Massacre with 56 pages. It is by far the longest in the book. By the questions he asks and the statements he makes, one can ascertain the importance of this chapter held for the author. Charles Johnson sums up the reason for the chapter in one long complex sentence. He says, quote, "There has been much conflict and diversity of opinion among the older class that has been handed down to the young generation as to just what the evidence really was on which the jury passed their verdict of guilt," unquote. To simplify Mr. Johnson's statement, for the past 45 years people have been fighting and debating about the evidence presented against Dr. Taylor and the verdict of the jury. He knew that this debate would live on with the next generation, but he was concerned that the debate would continue long after the evidence for both and against Dr. Taylor would be forgotten. His fears were justified. Over the last 130 years, Dozens of stories have arisen trying to explain why a well-respected doctor, preacher, and ex-lawman would ambush and kill the family of a man who had been a quadriplegic for over a year. In the introduction of the book, Mr. Johnson admits that he is not a historian. This fact plays out in the chapter about the massacre. Although Mr. Johnson does a good job in covering several events that happened around the massacre, he is non-linear in his presentation. He tends to jump around from topic to topic and subject to subject. What is more, he actually quotes several wives' tales about the event. The easiest of these statements he could have easily debunked is the fact that Dr. Taylor did not leave his Taut Hall guard duty to go on the massacre of the Mullins party. In his coverage of the trial, Charles Johnson explains that the copy of the transcript he obtained was the transcript that was sent to the appellate court. He also tells us that other than the transcript and 4 affidavits, everything else concerning the trial has been lost. This will become important in a later video. Please note, part of this story, the questions asked of the witness are fictional, because at the time of the Dr. Taylor trial, shorthand reporting had not come into popularity, nor was court reporting efficiently done. In making a transcript of evidence to be used in an appeal to the State Court of Appeals, the judge would write the appeal. The lawyers would write out the evidence or testimony given by each witness in narrative style. These transcripts were not done in the present-day question and answer style, as only the answers given by the witness was recorded. If the lawyers' transcripts did not agree on the testimony given by the witness, the judge would then write the questions which caused the disputed evidence in the transcript of the trial. This is done only once in the transcript, but according to Mr. Johnson, there were 12 exceptions that were supposed to be sent to the appellate court with the transcript. These exceptions, whatever they were, never made it to the court and now have been lost to time. This is the record of the testimony as given by John Vint Bentley, the Kentucky magistrate who stood as a witness at the Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor trial. Please note, part of this story, the questions asked of the witnesses are fictional, because at the time of the Taylor trial, shorthand reporting had not come into popularity, nor was court reporting efficiently done. In the making of a transcript of evidence to be used in an appeal to the State Court of Appeals, the judge would write the appeal, the lawyers would write out the evidence or testimony given by each witness in a narrative style. These transcripts were not done in the present-day question and answer style, as only the answers are given by the witnesses that was recorded. If the lawyer's transcripts did not agree on the testimony given by the witness, the judge would then write the questions which caused the disputed evidence in the transcript of the trial. This is done only in this transcript. But according to Mr. Johnson, there were 12 exceptions that were supposed to be sent to the appellate court with the transcript. These exceptions, whatever they were, never made it to the court, and now have been lost to time. John Vint Bentley was a magistrate in Kentucky and the owner of a small country store that was located at the foot of Pine Mountain, somewhere close to where Sweetwater is today. The story goes that he and Virginia native Robert Mullins had conducted the crime scene investigation of the Pound Gap Massacre. It is also of importance to note that 1.5 to 2 hours earlier, the Mullins party had stopped at his general store and purchased a can of peaches. Specifically, the Mullins party had met Jane and Ira's mother, Martha Mullins, at John Bentley's store. Whether or not this meeting was pre-planned is anyone's guess. However, hindsight being 20/20, there was a small altercation at the meeting. Jane Mullins first wanted and then insisted that her and Wilson's daughter, Amarinda or Mindy, be left in custody of her grandmother. Eventually, her father Wilson interceded on behalf of Jane and bribed Mindy to accompany her grandmother by purchasing her a can of peaches. John Bentley's testimony went pretty much the way of the testimony of Robert Mullins had gone, with a few exceptions. He gave testimony regarding his residence and to when he had arrived at the crime scene. He testified that he was not the first to arrive, and that when he had got there, everyone in the Mullins party were dead. He then testified that he took the deceased back to Kentucky to bury them, and goes on to testify that he had held an inquest over the bodies in Kentucky. John Bentley then was asked about the condition of Ira Mullins's body, and he reports that Ira had sustained 8 bullet shots. Bentley was then asked about the ambush site and the rock pile from where the ambush was staged, and he replied by saying that he had examined the ground where they were shot, and that he saw the place where the parties were said to have stood that did the shooting. When asked about the specifics of the rock pile, he testified that a few cartridge holes were found in the place, and the place was made up of 2 rocks formed by nature, with an opening between them, and the other rocks built up around them. He went on to say that there were a few bushes piled up in front of the rocks, and described them as being black pine, maple, and chestnut. Bentley then describes the bushes as seeming to be wilted. He then states that the blind would conceal a man if he was sitting down or on his knees, but that you would be able to see him if or when he was standing up. From his breast up, there was an open space between the rocks and the road except the brush stuck up in front of the rocks. He then reports that there was ample space between the brush to shoot through. When asked about the bullet shells, he states that he did examine them when they were found, and that he was asked about the account book which was taken from the body of John Chappelle at the inquest. The prosecution then switched up the questions by asking about the conditions of the bodies of Louanza Mullins and John Chappelle. This line of questioning included asking about the age, occupation, and living arrangements of John. John Vint Bentley's testimony is finished up with questions about Ira Mullins's business, which is described as trading in liquor. He also testifies that Ira had a reputation of always carrying a good deal of money. The questioning then reverts to asking more questions about the ambush site, and he describes the bush blind as being 20 or 25 steps from the road. He is then asked about the height of the rock pile, which he described as 4 or 5 feet high. John Bentley is then asked a peculiar question about the state of the brush pile, in which he describes the chestnut brush as wilted, and states that the weather was warm and it could have wilted in a day, but that it looked like they had been there for 2 or 3 days, and states that the leaves on the brush were not full size. There is no note of the defense questioning John Bentley. However, John Bentley had described the chestnut brush as appearing to have been wilted for a couple of days. This makes us question his testimony. This was a well-traveled road. One would think that if this brush blind had been there for several days, someone would have seen it, or questioned why it had been there. Yet several witnesses testify as living close to the site, and no one else is asked if they had seen or had been told about this new brush pile by the road. What's more is in the oft-told story, we think that the testimony is the basis for the folk tales stating that Doc Taylor and the Flemings had been staking out the ambush site for several days. If this had been so, one would think that someone would have testified as to seeing or hearing about the group of men camped out beside the road on the mountain. Yet no one does. But to be fair, Mr. Bentley and his testimony about the chestnut brush, at the time this would have been an American chestnut tree. This species of chestnut had become blighted by 1892, but the blight would not be discovered until 1904. This blight killed an estimated 2 billion chestnut trees in the area shown in the photo. John Sergent, who was born in 1907, once stated that when he was a small boy on the mountain, in and around Letcher County, it was full of dead chestnut trees to the point that it looked like there was a winter in July. This is the record of the testimony as given by John Harrison Mullins, the son of Ira and Louanza Mullins, who stood as a witness at the Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor trial. Because of the circumstances, the testimony of John Harrison Mullins was very limited. It consisted of who he was, the makeup of the party, and to establish a timeline for the events leading up to the massacre. He continued his testimony relating to the story about what he saw as the ambush began. This included seeing Wilson stagger and one of the horses falling as he started running down the mountain. John also testifies that his suspender had been shot nearly in two and that he had ran all the way down to the little town of Pound. He goes on to tell the court that the first people he had talked to was George Francisco and Jemima Harris. John Mullins is then asked about the shooters, to which he replies that he did not see any of them. The prosecution then asked John Harrison to describe how the parties were arranged when the shooting began. It is of interest to note that his answer contradicts the testimony of his Aunt Jane when she was later asked the same question. For the most part, John's testimony matches the testimony given by Robert Mullins as to where the bodies were found, and Jane's does not. This will be covered in greater detail in our video about the testimony of Jane Mullins. John's testimony was, at the time of the shooting began, he and Greenberry Harris had been walking just behind the wagon. His father, mother, and John Chappell were all in the wagon, and his Uncle Wilson was before the wagon. An interesting point here is that some sites report that Wilson had, like Jane, been on horseback. He then states that his aunt, Jane Mullins, was on horseback just behind the Harris boy and himself. Another interesting point to make here is that there are many stories about Jane and her horse, including several that Jane had told herself. Several of the stories state that Jane had fallen behind, and that John and Greenberry had noticed this, and had, quote, just been wondering where Jane was, unquote, when the shots began. Although we could not find no corroboration for the versions of the story, one must wonder if this was something that John had related to people later in life. From all accounts, it seems that John and his aunt had become estranged after the shooting. The land and cabin of Wilson and Jane in Camden was either returned to the widow Vanover or was sold soon after. In October of 1892, just 10 days after Jane was released from protective custody, Jane and her new husband Isaac Belcher would move into Ira's cabin in Pound, Virginia. This would have left John Harrison Mullins homeless. The prosecution finished questioning of John Mullins by asking him about the number of shots fired and if his father had any money. To this, John answers that he thought that there must have been 100 shots fired and that his father did have money. He goes on to tell the court that his mother was carrying part of it in a belt under her dress, and that the rest of it was in a little handbag in the wagon. He also tells that the pocket was cut out of the belt his mother had been wearing, that the handbag was missing, and that he thought there was about $1,000 or more between the two. The defense asked no more questions of John Harrison Mullins. The following is a paraphrase of what is found in Charles Johnson's book about the testimony. This is in reference to the trial of Ira Mullins versus the widow Vanover over the land in Camden and Jenkins, Kentucky. Because Dr. Taylor had testified against Ira Mullins in that trial, a threat was made. This is what was recorded in the Dr. Taylor trial concerning that threat. Noah Hubbard testified that he lived on Birchfield Creek. The witness would further testify that he and Dr. Taylor would have a conversation at his house about the shooting of Ira Mullins. He said that Dr. Taylor told him that, quote, some person or persons had shot through Ira Mullins' window into his bedclothes, but it was not him, unquote. The witness testified that this was because Ira Mullins had offered $100 to have Dr. Taylor killed on Saturday. However, Ira's bed was shot into on Sunday. The witness then stated that Dr. Taylor had then told him that he was in Kentucky when Ira Mullins had offered the reward to have him killed. Hubbard then stated that, quote, He said that he was going to keep in the brush and keep the law on his side, unquote. The witness then stated that Mr. Collins came at this point in the conversation and nothing more was said. He thought that the conversation happened on court day before Ira Mullins was killed. The witness also stated that he did not have a very distinct recollection of the conversation. However, Dr. Taylor did not have a Winchester with him and he did not remember about the pistol. This concludes the testimony of Noah Hubbard. The defense did not have any recorded questions of Mr. Hubbard. As the first person on the scene after the shooting had stopped, the Commonwealth called Jemima Harris to the stand. This is a paraphrase of the testimony as found in the Charles Johnson book. Jemima Harris testified that she had heard of the death of Ira Mullins from his son, John Harrison Mullins, on the evening of May 14, 1892, about 2 p.m. She had previously lived with Ira and his wife Lorenza at their Pound, Virginia residence. Harris testified that she had heard that Ira and the others had been killed, so she immediately headed off to the Pound Gap area. On her way to the area, she passed by the house of Floyd Branham. She got his wife to go with her to the place where Ira and the others had been killed. We strongly urge everyone who is sensitive to how someone is found at the time of their death to please skip this section of the testimony. She testified that when she reached the place of the killing, she found Ira and Lorenza Mullins, John Chappell, Wilson Mullins, and Greenberry Harris laying dead. She stated in her testimony that Wilson Mullins was on his face, laying in the road dead about 15 steps from the wagon. Ira Mullins was shot in the face and temple, but did not look for wounds on other parts of his body. Her son, Greenberry Harris, was shot in the head. The 2 horses were shot and killed. Ira Mullins' wife, Lorenza, was laying flat on her back with her top dress thrown up, and her legs were crushed or broken and were doubled back behind her body. Harris testified that they had straightened her out and covered her face. Harris also testified that she, quote, saw right smart of blood around each body, all of them were dead, never looked around the ground very much, unquote. At this point, Harris testifies that Spencer Branham lived on the foot of the mountain and was the closest residence to the place of the shooting. Harris states that she saw bullet holes in the wagon and that she knew that Ira had money and his wife Lorenza carried it in a pocket on a belt under her clothes. Harris states that she had lived with Ira Mullins all of that spring because he was paralyzed and couldn't help himself. She stated that he could not feed himself without help. Harris states that, quote, about 3 weeks before he was killed, someone shot through the window into his bed. The ball went into the shot through the window into his bed. The ball went into the bed covers on which he was lying. The ball looked like a .44 to her. She didn't know that Dr. Taylor carried a .44 pistol. She didn't know where the ball was, unquote. She then stated that Ira Mullins lived at Pound, Virginia, close to Eli Swindle and Doc Swindle, that they were not over a quarter mile from his residence. Harris stated that the last time that she saw Ira, Lorenza, Greenberry, and John was the Saturday before the killing when they started to Elkhorn in Kentucky. Harris then testified that she saw Ira's wife had some money before she started, but that she didn't know how much it was. However, it was well known in the community that Ira Mullins had money and his wife Lorenza carried it. There is no record of the defense questioning the witness, and thus ends the testimony of Jemima Harris.
Dr. Taylor's Gun, Part 1, the Court Transcripts and Affidavits. The Civil War affected the Appalachian people of West Virginia, Kentucky, and southwestern Virginia like no other people. In the mountains, family feuds were not uncommon before the war. But here, the Civil War adage of brother versus brother and family versus family really occurred. Although the Civil War would end in May of 1865, for the people of these mountains, the strife and struggle of the war would continue for years. These uncivil wars, known as family feuds, would become more bitter and bloodier than ever before. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of feuds. For the most part, these feuds were between different families, but after the Civil War, some of the most bitter and bloodiest feuds often happened among members of the same family. The most famous of the feuds was, of course, the one between the Hatfields and McCoys. The feud drew national attention, and as the feud was winding down, the reporters sent to cover it started reporting on other events happening in the area. Some of these reporters often tried to tie these events to the Hatfield and McCoy feud in some way. If unable to do so, the events were often portrayed as previously unreported feud activity between the families of the people involved in them, even though these feuds may or may not have existed. We find ourselves grateful to these reporters, as this is the only reason that we can find national reports about certain events and people like Henry Vanover, Ira Mullins, Todd Hall, and Clifton Branham prior to the end of the Hatfield and McCoy feud. As the famous feud was ending, national interest in the area waned. Newspaper reporters began to withdraw from the area, and then the Pound Gap Massacre occurred. The timing of these two events and their proximity to each other would continue to generate newspaper headlines about the people involved in them and the area well into the 1900s, when the area would once again make national headlines about the Consolidation Coal Company and the 7 modern cities they were building. Combined, these three events would continue to make national headlines well into the 1940s. But unlike Consol and the Hatfield and McCoy feud, only the Pound Gap Massacre generated dozens of new and contradicting myths, stories, and folk tales. We believe that the reason this occurred can be tied directly to the trial of Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor, the actions of Commonwealth attorney Robert Bruce, and the unreliable testimony of Jane Mullins. But an even greater reason for the rise of these myths, stories, and folk tales can be attributed to the rifle of Dr. Taylor and the 4 affidavits about it that is attached to the transcript of the trial. And these myths, stories, and folk tales occurred before the contents of the transcripts and the affidavits of the trial were known to the general public. In fact, there is no evidence that the public had any knowledge of them until Charles Johnson wrote his 1938 book, A Narrative History of Wise County, Virginia. But there is ample evidence that the public may have had a general knowledge of the particulars of the case, even though the exact contents of the transcript and the affidavits were unknown. Normally, this would be attributed to newspaper reporting, but in the case of the Taylor trial, the local newspaper had been shut down from April 1892 through December of that year. In addition, no national newspaper reported anything other than the verdict of the trial, so the source of the public knowledge of their contents remains a mystery. In his book, Mr. Johnson tells us that after the verdict was returned against him, Dr. Taylor moved the court in arrest of judgment and to set aside the verdict of the jury and grant him a new trial for various grounds of error assigned at bar. Specifically, what was known to the public about this error can be found in a newspaper interview of Dr. Taylor. The interview was done while Taylor awaited appeal in the Lynchburg, Virginia jail, and up until 1938, this was the only source of information that tells us that the jury examined and modified the rifle of Dr. Taylor. It is the affidavits which corroborate that newspaper story. They tell us that although the jury was granted permission to examine the rifle, no permission was given for them to disassemble the rifle or to modify it. What's more, We learn from the jailhouse interview that the examination and alteration was done without the knowledge or consent of the defense. The court overruled the defense's move to arrest judgment based on the actions of the jury and refused to grant a mistrial on those same grounds. We are then told by Mr. Johnson that through his counsel, Dr. Taylor accepted, and the defense then wrote out 12 bills of exception. The court then signed those 12 bills and ordered them to be made part of the court record of the case. As we have said before, Mr. Johnson admits that he is not a historian. What's more is that in telling the story of the Killing Rock, Mr. Johnson is hard to follow because he is not linear in his record, and he tends to jump from topic to topic. But if you take notes paying attention to what he says and what he doesn't say about a particular topic, you discover that Mr. Johnson was not happy that either certain parts of the court record had been lost or that he was not allowed access to certain information. These 12 exceptions are a prime example. Exceptions are no longer used in modern court cases. The reason for this is that an exception could possibly make a modern court transcript exceptionally long. What an exception was is a lengthy written-out objection to a particular testimony, court ruling, or piece of evidence. These were meant to give a higher court insight into something that had occurred in a court case and provide justification for hearing an appeal. Mr. Johnson was told about these 12 exceptions by the still living officers of the circuit court from the time of the trial. He was also told by them that the judge had signed those exceptions and ordered that they be made part of the court record. Yet when he obtained the only copy of the transcript from the appellate court, those exceptions were not part of the record. And he is also told by the circuit court in Wise County that no record of what those exceptions were existed when he was doing his research. Charles A. Johnson was a retired court clerk, and he was nearly blind when he wrote his book. He tells us that in some cases, he had to have someone read some of the source material to him. We're also told that his vision was so bad that he had to dictate the book and someone else had to type it out. But by what he says about everything he was told about the Pound Gap Massacre, Mr. Johnson understood when someone was trying to pull the wool over his eyes. We also believe that is why he opens a section in his book about the trial by asking the same questions that have been asked about that trial for the past 130 years. In a narrative history of Wise County, Virginia, we are told that the transcript in the book was the only one in existence, and that this transcript was the one sent to the appellate court. We are then told that it is given to us word for word in the book. Does this mean that those 12 exceptions never made it to the appellate court? In addition to the information about the appeal in Mr. Johnson's book, there are two newspaper clips that seem to bear this out. The first one of these is dated December 1892 and tells us that the court was not going to hear the appeal, but one of the 5 appellate judges sent a last-minute stay of execution and that a court date would be set later. The second article is from July 1893 and tells us of 3 cases the appellate court had heard that day. In 2 of these cases, we are given the majority and minority opinion of the case. We are also given the names and verdict vote of all 5 judges. But in the Taylor case, we are only given 2 of the judges' names. In addition, we are told these 2 judges were in opposition without the opinion of either one, and the opposing judge was the one who had issued the last-minute stay the previous December. The often told tale tells us that the appellate court ruled against Dr. Taylor because No evidence was given that would have merited a new trial. Again, did the appellate court have no record of the 12 exceptions, or was the transcript written in a way as to not reflect the evidence presented in court, or was it a combination of both? Remember what Mr. Johnson had said in his book. At the time, the defense did not prepare appeals. Those were written out by the judge and his staff, then sent to the higher court. So what happened in September 1892 that caused Dr. Taylor's defense team to ask for a mistrial? After the move to declare a mistrial was overruled, what was that original exception? As we have already stated, Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor's rifle is a topic of the utmost importance. The often told tale states that the jury had based its decision of guilt solely upon its findings when they, the jury, examined the rifle. This statement from the story is never given with any explanation. In addition, if this statement is true, then the testimony of Jane Mullins had been discarded by the jury. While awaiting appeal in the Lynchburg jail, an interview of Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor ran in the newspapers. The interview covered nearly a full page. However, the entire interview was not picked up by all outlets. What is often left out is the fact that Dr. Taylor and his defense team expected the appellate court to overturn the lower court's decision. This belief was based upon the way in which the examination of his rifle took place by the jury. But what is not told in either the often told tale or the newspaper interview is of the existence of the 4 affidavits. These affidavits are about the examination of Dr. Taylor's rifle. What's more is that they corroborate the statements made by Dr. Taylor in that newspaper interview. According to all 4 of the affidavits attached to the transcript of the trial, 3 of the jurors not only examined the rifle, but they had altered it. When we examine the transcript of the trial, very little about the rifle is ever attested to. The prosecution focuses on the shell casings found at the crime scene and asking witnesses if they knew the make and caliber of Dr. Taylor's rifle. At first this seems strange until the defense calls their witnesses. It is only during the testimony of the witnesses for the defense that the whereabouts of the rifle is discovered. In fact, when the original indictment was issued, it read that Dr. Taylor had used a gun valued at $5 to kill Ira Mullins. When that original indictment was quashed, the new indictment read, quote, a pistol valued at $5, unquote. But by the time of the September trial, the prosecution knew that Dr. Taylor's pistols did not match the ammunition found at the crime scene and shifted his focus to the unfound rifle. So why did the prosecution shift its focus to the rifle? There are multiple clues as to why this happened. The often told story tells us that at the inquest, Henry Adams and James Potter were named as suspects because of the type of rifles they owned. However, the clue is found in the fact that these stories say that the casings were rimfire and were for a government-issued rifle. This is corroborated in another part of the story that may have directly come from the 3 jurors in the first affidavit. The often told story says that Doc Taylor's gun was dry-fired, using one of the shell casings found at the crime scene. This story relates that the plunger or firing pin struck the shell casings, quote, just off center, unquote, and did not match the original strike to the casing. This story is often given as the reason or excuse for the examination of the rifle by the jury. But it is the second affidavit that verifies the story of the shell casings being rimfire. The affidavit was sworn out by I.N. Mills. This affidavit reads very much like the first affidavit. I think it is of importance to note here that it is this similarity, as well as others found in the transcript, along with a few statements found in the transcript that are difficult to read and seem to make no sense, that make us believe that some of the statements may have been altered, especially when it comes to the statements about the ammunition casings found at the crime scene, and certain statements made about the rifle given as evidence before the rifle was found and was entered into evidence. The part of Mr. Mills' affidavit that is different from the first affidavit and corroborates that the casings were rimfire, as well as contradicting several statements from the transcript, reads, quote, "Upon such examination, we reach the conclusion that the gun had been tampered with recently, so as to make the plunger strike the cartridge in the center instead of on the side, which examination caused me and F.P. Graham, to my knowledge, to find a verdict of guilty, while if we had not made such an investigation, we would not have found such a verdict. At least I know I would not, and Graham said he would not, but I do not know what effect it had on the other jurors." Unquote. We need to pause here and give some thought as to why Mr. Mills swore out this affidavit. Mr. Mills was not one of the three who had disassembled the rifle. He had no cause to swear out the affidavit other than to tell us that it was only because of the examination of the rifle that the jury voted guilty. The first affidavit just tells us the names of the three jurors that disassembled and altered the rifle. We only know that the rifle was altered thanks to the final two affidavits made by Sheriff Holbrook and his gunsmith deputy. They tell us about a part of the rifle that the jury either could not or did not use when they reassembled it. They also tell us that the deputy had examined the rifle before and after the jury had examined it, and when it was returned from the jury, the firing pin was assembled in a way in which he had never seen before. This is probably where the often told story comes from, which states that the rifle was now inoperable. But the often told story about the ammunition being rimfire is also corroborated by the affidavit of I.N. Mills. This means that all the testimony statements about the ammunition being 45-75 may have been altered, as well as the testimony about the number of rifles in the area as being 45-75. We base this upon the fact that both the story and the affidavit tells us that the ammunition casings found at the scene were rim-fired, and no true .45 caliber rim-fired ammunition has ever been made. This seems to play out in the testimony about the rifle of Henry Adams. Twice it is given as being 45-75, but once it is stated that his rifle was 44-75, a rifle that did not exist in 1892, but a rim-fired 44-40 repeating rifle did. This rifle was capable of using a low-cost and very popular type of ammunition, which, because of its name and its markings, had the reputation of being for a rifle that was government issued. Dr. Taylor's Gun, Part 2, The Rifle and Ammunition. In Part 1 of Dr. Taylor's Gun, we discussed the indictment against Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor. In another video in this series, we discussed the fact that the original indictment was quashed and that a new indictment was issued. The only major change in these two indictments was the gun used by Taylor. In our last video, we discussed the fact that the original indictment had stated that Dr. Taylor had used a gun valued at $5 to kill Ira Mullins. That was changed to, quote, a pistol valued at $5, unquote, in the new indictment. But by the time of the September 1892 trial, the prosecution had abandoned the pistol in questioning and instead focused on the rifle. As we have stated, this was because by the time of the second indictment on July 26, Taylor had been arrested in possession of the two Colt .45 long pistols he owned. But by the time of the September trial, the prosecution knew that the ammunition casings found at the crime scene did not match those pistols. In Dr. Taylor's Gun, Part 1, we also examined the information given to us by Charles Johnson in his 1938 book, A Narrative History of Wise County, Virginia. We examined what Mr. Johnson had said about what he had been told about the case. We have also pointed out that Mr. Johnson went to great lengths to obtain, quote, the only existing copy of the transcript of the trial, unquote. Johnson tells us that the indictment, transcript, and affidavits he had obtained had come directly from the appellate court, and that the court had used this transcript as its basis for not granting a new trial to Taylor. But Johnson knew that there was something wrong. Johnson was a retired court clerk, and he knew that what he had been told by the surviving officers of the court from the trial did not match the evidence he had uncovered from the appellate court. In his telling of the story, Charles Johnson often seems vague in his details, though this is not because he is trying unintentionally to be vague. The appearance of vagueness comes from the fact that he intentionally tells the story in a rambling, non-linear way, indeed jumping from point to point in his telling of the story appears to tell another story, if you're aware of certain facts and know what to look for in what he says or doesn't say. Johnson seems to leave clues to this in several places in his book, and in a very peculiar statement, especially when considering that this odd statement is coming from a retired court clerk. One of these clues can be found in his telling about the massacre itself. He includes the myth that states that Dr. Taylor went AWOL from his guard duty in the middle of the night during the Talk Hall trial. This dereliction of duty is always explained as him preparing for the Ira Mullins shooting. This was never attested to during the Taylor trial. Some may argue that this shooting was not the Pound Gap Massacre itself, but was the, quote, shooting through the bedroom window, unquote, that occurred at Ira's home prior to the massacre. There are several problems with this myth. The Hall trial ended in February of 1892. The bedroom shooting occurred in April, and the massacre was in May. Anyone from the time of the massacre would have known that this myth was not true. Additionally, this is one of the easiest of the myths, stories, and folk tales to debunk. So why did Johnson include it in his book? In the last chapter of A Narrative History of Wise County, Virginia, Johnson is emphatic to tell us about the transcript. This is the only existing copy, and it is the one that was sent to the appellate court. However, Johnson has already told us that 12 exceptions have been made to the trial, and that these exceptions were supposed to be attached to this transcript. But the only things he was able to obtain from the appellate court was a two-part indictment, the transcript, and the affidavits. The two-part indictment was a melding of the two separate indictments. We know this because the two parts are duplicates of each other with a single word difference. One reads gun, the second reads pistols. We believe that this may have been one of the exceptions. Taylor was indicted with the accusation that he had used his pistols, but after reading the transcript and the affidavits, we know that this indictment was abandoned in favor of the rifle. To justify the indictment in the eyes of the appellate court, we believe that the original indictment reading gun was attached to the pistol indictment. We think that Charles Johnson may have understood this as well, and therefore he opens the last chapter of the book by asking the same questions about the trial that has now been asked for 130 years. However, we have no way of knowing if Charles Johnson suspected as we do that some of the testimony about the physical evidence in the court record had been altered to reflect the rifle in the transcript sent to the appellate court. But considering the odd statement he makes after asking the questions, he also may have suspected an alteration. He states, quote, "There has been much conflict and diversity of opinion among the older class that has been handed down to the young generation as to just what the evidence really was on which the jury passed their verdict of guilt," unquote. He then tells us about the transcript, and instead of stating, "Here is the evidence, the matter is settled," he tells us to read the transcript and decide the answer for ourselves. Basically, he is stating that he is recording everything he discovered in his investigation, specifically so that the younger generation and those in the future asking the same questions will know why those questions were being asked from the day the massacre happened. Likewise, we believe that others who were more intimate with the trial were asking the same questions and leaving clues as they were able. Take John Fox Jr. Although his book, Trail of the Lonesome Pine, is a work of fiction, it is well known in the mountains that the work is based upon real people and real events. We believe he gave us a clue to the questions surrounding Doc's gun and the ammunition casings found at the crime scene. In his book, Mr. Fox says that the Red Fox carried a rim-fired Winchester 50-70. There are several problems with this statement. John Fox's book was published in 1912. It is by looking at this date and the information he gives about the gun that several problems arise. In 1912, the Winchester 50-70 did not exist, and would not until Winchester introduced the Model 70 in the 1920s. This was the first gun by Winchester that used 50 caliber ammunition, and no ammunition produced larger than a .44 has ever been produced in a rimfire variant. So what is it that John Fox is telling us? Basically, what he is saying is wrong caliber, wrong gun. How do we know this? John Fox Jr. was intimate to both the Taut Hall and the Dr. Taylor trials, as he was listed as a guard at the Wise County Jail for both cases. And it is said that in both cases he had used Doc Taylor's rifle while guarding the jailhouse. This meant that he also had intimate knowledge of the type of rifle Taylor, aka the Red Fox, owned and the type of ammunition that it used. According to letters kept by the family, Dr. Taylor's rifle was a rare gun. It was the first big game rifle produced by Winchester. It was also the first true .45 caliber rifle ever produced, and it was the second centerfire rifle that was ever made by Winchester. The rifle cost well over $5 and was only produced in a limited run. The official name of the rifle was, quote, the Winchester 1876 Centennial Repeating Rifle, unquote. The Colt 45 GOVT ammunition was a variant of the very common rim-fired Henry .44 long cartridge that got its name in two ways. Originally, it was supposed to be for a Colt .45 caliber rifle produced for the U.S. Cavalry. Basically, the unscrupulous gun manufacturer reproduced a variant of the .44 Henry repeating rifle. The only real difference was that Colt manufactured ammunition using the Colt 45 GOVT name on the ammunition box. After the company was caught and made to make amends to the government, Colt sold the ammunition works to the U.S. Cartridge Company. This company renamed the ammunition and started stamping U.S. on the bottom of the shell casings. To anyone who found one of these popular .44 Henry long shells, they would have been immediately recognized because of the U.S. stamp. And because of this stamp, they were often mistakenly said to have been the ammunition of a government-issued rifle, just as the often told story tells us. The Model 1873 Winchester repeating rifle, often called, quote, the gun that won the West, unquote, was produced in two variants. The first was rim-fired and used the very common Henry 4440 long ammunition. The second variant used the new 4470 WCF or Winchester center fire ammunition, which was a center fire modification of the Henry 44 long. At the time, it was very common and desirable that both your rifle and your pistol to use the same ammunition. Therefore, prior to 1894, Winchester sold more rim-fire model 1873 repeating rifles than the WCF variant. This was because there was a multitude of rifles and pistols which used ammunition based upon the Henry 44 long ammunition. In 1894, Winchester started producing the 1873 rifle in a variant that had a dual firing pin that resembled a capital H. This variant was capable of firing both the rimfire and the centerfire ammunition. They would also produce a kit to modify the earlier rifles. This fact, more than anything else, is what made the Model 1873 rifle so popular, as it could fire any 44 caliber ammunition on hand. This included the ammunition produced by the U.S. Ammunition Company. But Dr. Taylor's rifle was a true 45 caliber rifle. Other than a slight bottlenecking on the 45 WCF ammo, it is impossible to distinguish the size difference by eye between it and the ammunition based upon the Henry 44 long. An interesting note here. Dr. Taylor's rifle could not chamber the long Colt 45 ammunition made for his pistols. That ammunition would have had to be manually inserted into the rifle chamber before it could be fired. But the Colt pistols he carried could fire the 45-75 WCF ammo made for his rifle. Likewise, Dr. Taylor's rifle could not chamber any variant of the Henry 44 long ammunition because of the slight size difference and the lacking bottleneck feature. However, the 44 long ammunitions could have been manually chambered one at a time, but because of the size difference, Taylor's rifle would have always struck the shell casings just off center, as we are told in the story. What this meant is that Dr. Taylor's rifle could not chamber or fire any of the 44 rimfire ammunition variants. It was also incapable of chambering the 4470 WCF. They would also have to be manually chambered. The rifle could fire them, but the strike would also have been just off center. We understand that this may be confusing for some of our readers. However, it is important to keep in mind that Dr. Taylor's gun was not capable of firing the type of bullets indicated by the shell casings that were left under the pine cones. Dr. Taylor's gun had not been entered into evidence prior to the last day of testimony. Testimony was given at that time that the rifle was in working condition and had been used and fired over the course of the trial. The rifle was not returned from the jury in its former working condition. This alone triggered the first exception in the trial and should have been grounds for a mistrial. However, for whatever reason, the judge overruled the call for a mistrial, sentence was then passed, and the discrepancies were allowed to stand. On a last further note, from all accounts, the rifle and the part listed in Sheriff Holbrook's affidavit disappeared after the trial.
We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our series on the Killing Rock. Don't forget to hit the like button, as more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube will suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell for notification. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we bring to you the history of the Appalachian Mountains. We must remind everyone that the story names Killing Rock, the Oft-Told Tales, and Killing Rock, the Untold Story, and Killing Rock, the Trial are all under Kentucky Tennessee Living copyright.